This video is already longer than most of my videos, and I'm now making it even longer by adding this intro. But the thing is that this video is the one I wanted to make when I started doing videos in the first place. The story of the word Idaho is one of the funniest, most enigmatic of all of our states' names. And I believe I have uncovered some information about it that has not been written or talked about before. So I apologize that there's a lot of information that comes at you pretty fast. And I do jump around in time a little, so at the end of the video I'll be going back over this story chronologically. I'm planning to release a second sort of addendum video that has a few more stories about some of the characters that I couldn't fit into this one, so you can look for that soon. And finally, as far as I know, there is no picture of George Willing on record, and he is kind of the star of the video. So a friend drew a cartoon one for me. You'll see. So without further ado, in 1875, there was a story making the rounds in Washington, D.C. that this poet named Joaquin Miller had been telling for over a decade. Miller was taking credit for naming the territory of Idaho. Now, Miller was a colorful character, about whom we will talk more later. He's sometimes referred to historically as the poet of the Sierras, but author Ambrose Bierce dubbed him the greatest liar this country has ever produced. Well, I think there was one guy who, upon hearing that, turned over in his grave and muttered, "Hold my beer." George M. Doc Willing was a liar and con artist of the highest order, and was probably the guy who did name Idaho. But the only real evidence we have comes from a letter written in December of 1875 by one William O. Stoddard in response to Joaquin Miller's assertions. Stoddard had been a secretary to Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln in the White House, and he too had a rather inventive imagination. We'll talk more about him later as well. But trying to uncover the truth between these three inveterate liars is something of a challenge. But let's give it a shot, shall we? Part 1, Congress. What we know. When Congress was debating a name for the new territory that would eventually become the state of Colorado, the word Idaho was one of the many proposed names. The first ever record of the word Idaho came in late March of 1860, when the territorial committees in Congress were discussing proposed names for the region. A paragraph which appears in several newspapers around the country, including Baltimore's Daily Exchange and the New York Herald, asserts that there seems to be considerable difficulty about the selection of a name for Pikes Peak territory. It has been called Jefferson, but those in authority assert that as there cannot be states enough to name after all the presidents, that it will not be policy to go beyond Washington, who stands alone in his glory. This isn't true. The reason some senators opposed the name Jefferson is because historically Thomas Jefferson is associated with the Democratic Party. The senators who opposed the name were all members of the new Republican Party. Anyway, the story then gives several possible names for the region, including Tampa, Lula, San Juan, and critically for our purposes, Idaho, meaning Gem of the Mountains. The story then concludes, the House committee seemed to have hit upon the very appropriate name of Tahosa, which means dwellers on the mountaintops. This or Idaho will probably be adopted. Now, I cannot stress enough that the committee deliberations and this newspaper story from around March of 1860 are the first time the word Idaho appears in any record that historians have found. The bill came out of committee with the name Jefferson, but after the 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln, most Republicans were confident that they could get the name changed. In January of 1861, a senator named Jacob Collamer of Vermont, a Republican, introduced an amendment to the organizing bill that had been submitted by the committee that would change the name from Jefferson to Idaho. Collamer claimed he had been approached by people of the country, meaning people from what was usually called Pikes Peak region, or what is today Colorado, and promised to propose the name Idaho. The change, however, was strenuously objected to by Senator Joseph Lane of Oregon, and remember him because we'll hear about him again. Lane was a Democrat who supported slavery, and a few months before this debate, he had been the vice presidential candidate on the Southern Democratic ticket, a ticket that, of course, lost to Abraham Lincoln. 6 weeks after this debate, Lane would return to Oregon a private citizen, having also lost his Senate seat, largely due to his pro-slavery views. But for now, Joseph Lane is sitting in the Senate, and he hears someone propose the name Idaho and decides to take a stand. He said, "I do not believe it is an Indian word. It is a corruption. No Indian tribe in this nation has that word, in my opinion." To which Mr. Collamer replied, I presume rather sheepishly, "I do not understand Indian." Lane continued, "It is a corruption, certainly a counterfeit, and ought not to be adopted." For Joseph Lane to so strenuously claim that the word is a fake, a fraud, that no Indian language has that word, is beyond extraordinary. He was not some kind of expert in indigenous dialects, and even if he had been, he could not have been certain that no Indian tribe in this nation has that word. So why did he say it? Well, I have my theories, and we're getting to that. On an almost party line vote, the amendment was agreed to and the name changed to Idaho. All 19 Republicans voted in favor of Idaho, and only 5 of 23 Democrats voted with them. Remember here that we are in January of 1861. 6 southern states had already seceded from the Union to protest Abraham Lincoln's election. And while Lincoln would not be inaugurated for a few more weeks, 9 Southern Democratic senators had already withdrawn from office. The issue of slavery influenced every debate in Congress, especially those with regard to new territories. And even though the Senate was now 9 senators lighter, many of those Democrats who remained, like Joseph Lane of Oregon, tended to have strong convictions regarding slavery. So it's not surprising that votes like this one tended to fall along party lines. That was January 30th of 1861. The real drama happened a few days later on February 4th. On that day, the Senate was scheduled to read the organizing bill for Idaho a third time and take a final vote on it. But a few more amendments were proposed, one of them by Republican Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts. Wilson proposed that the name be changed to Colorado, and he claimed to be doing it at the request of the delegate from that territory. Wilson claimed that that delegate, a man named B.D. Williams, was very anxious about it and came to see me today to have that change made. He said, "This word Idaho meant nothing. There is nothing in it." When another senator pointed out that it was that same delegate who had insisted on Idaho in the first place, Wilson replied abruptly, "He has changed his opinion." So the name was changed again, this time to Colorado. The bill was passed, and Colorado Territory was created. A couple of years later, while the Civil War was raging, the issue of the name Idaho came up again, because Congress was again creating a new territory and was again considering the name Idaho for a new state. The territory being created had come out of committee with the name Montana, but one senator proposed changing it to Idaho. The source of that change is surprising. It was proposed by Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts, the same senator who had insisted on not using Idaho in the previous debates because he had learned that it was a fraud. But the name was changed and Idaho Territory was created. So that's what happened in the chambers of Congress. It is all verifiable because we have almost verbatim records of congressional debates. What we cannot be nearly as sure of is what was happening outside of Congress, besides the country being ripped apart by the issue of slavery. So let's back up a few years. Part 2, George Willing. George M. Doc Willing was born... That's my Mike Duncan impression. But the truth is, it is difficult to say when Doc Willing was born because he lied about everything, including his name and his date of birth. What I have been able to learn, largely with the help of ancestry databases online, is that he was born probably between 1823 and 1827 in Hardin County, Kentucky. His father, Jacob Willian, not Willing, and Mother Jane Thomas were married around 1831. So if you do the math, you can imagine young George and his family might have lied about when he was born in order to make it at least closer to, if not after, his parents' marriage. His parents would go on to have at least 2 more sons, but as far as I can tell, George was the only one who took the last name Willing. But he definitely assumed that name by the time he got married in 1844 to Mary Ann Lamar, and the 2 of them, along with much of George's family, moved to Missouri. These years of George's life, from birth up until 1859, are very difficult to discern because, again, he lied about everything, even to his own family. There is, in fact, a family story that he accompanied the great American pathfinder John C. Fremont on one of his trips to California. Almost certainly not true. He also told people that he had mined for gold near San Francisco, that he had lived for a time in Mexico, and also that he had studied medicine in southern Louisiana and had discovered a treatment for yellow fever. So you can see that determining the truth of his life during these years is nearly impossible. What is probably true is that he did learn a little about practicing medicine, because he did, after his move to St. Louis, set himself up as a doctor for a short time. But starting in 1859, the record becomes a bit clearer. In April of 1859, Doc Willing set out from St. Louis as part of a wagon train for the Pikes Peak gold fields to try to strike it rich prospecting. On his way toward Denver, he kept a diary and sent excerpts from it to his wife, at least one of which was published in a St. Louis newspaper. In Denver, Willing almost immediately got involved in politics. The miners of the region were clamoring for government and had decided to elect a representative to send to Washington who would lobby Congress for territory status and eventually statehood. Willing threw his hat into the ring, and when the votes were counted, he had won election. Unfortunately, at least 2 of the precinct's votes were ultimately declared fraudulent, putting Willing not first, but second to last in the vote count. Yes, real election fraud, imagine that. The actual delegate elected was a guy named B.D. Williams, and I'm not happy about it either that their names are so similar. Anyway, when questioned about the fraud in the election, Willing pleaded innocent, because of course he did, and appeared to accept the election of Williams as the rightful delegate. Now, it's not clear how or why, but when B.D. Williams traveled to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress, Willing went with him. So in early 1860, we find both B.D. Williams and George Willing in D.C., and while B.D. Williams was the duly elected delegate from that region, Willing also represented himself that way on occasion because, say it with me now, of course he did. It is during these months, after Willing and Williams got to Washington, that the word Idaho begins to appear in writing, first in the annals of debates in congressional committees, and then in newspapers. Now, it's possible that George Willing actually did make up the word Idaho, as will be asserted later by William O. Stoddard. But it is also possible that someone else back in the goldfields had made up the word and Willing latched onto it. Now, I'm going to speculate something here, so take it however you like, but it just makes sense to me. I think Willing had convinced Williams, and then he and Williams convinced certain congressmen to use the word Idaho. But Willing did it as a joke, and then went and bragged to some of his friends, including fellow Democrat. Did I mention Willing was a South-supporting Democrat? Including fellow Democrat Joseph Lane of Oregon and Lincoln Secretary William O. Stoddard, that he had just played this funny practical joke. So when Collamer actually went and proposed the name in Congress, Lane may have been appalled that the joke was being taken too far and strenuously argued against it. But he didn't want to get his friend Willing into trouble, so rather than confess Willing's joke to his colleagues, Lane argued that the word Idaho is a corruption. No Indian tribe in this nation has that word, in my opinion. If you've watched my video on Indian state names, it was pretty rare to find a congressman, or indeed any white American, who actually knew or cared what words came from indigenous languages and what they meant. So for Lane to be so certain in his denunciation of the word is, as I said before, extraordinary. I also think it's plausible that someone in Willing's confidence, or possibly even Willing himself, approached B.D. Williams with the truth about the word and convinced him of its unclear origins, which would be why Williams went to Henry Wilson the night before the final vote and insisted he changed the name to Colorado. But Williams, or whoever spoke to Wilson, again with the similar names, also didn't want to implicate Willing, and so only gave part of the story, which might explain why Wilson would, a few years later, believe it to be a perfectly useful word, whether or not it was actually an indigenous word that meant gem of the mountains. Anyway, very shortly after these debates, George Willing moved on from Washington, D.C., eventually winding up back home in St. Louis. He was arrested and jailed briefly during the Civil War as a Southern sympathizer, and the next we hear of him is after the war, when he becomes involved in one of the most notorious land speculation frauds in American history, the so-called Peralta Grant fraud in the 1870s. The morning after Willing registered his land claim at the courthouse in Prescott, Arizona, he was found dead under suspicious circumstances. His obituary in the Prescott newspaper contains an appropriate description of George M. Willing. He had his faults, not least of which was the habit of stretching the truth, but was, on the whole, a bold adventurer and intelligent man. Part 3. Lane, Miller, and Stoddard. Joseph Lane, who had sympathized with the Confederacy in the run-up to the Civil War, retired to his home in Oregon after losing re-election to the Senate in 1860. In 1862, Lane helped a friend of his start up a newspaper which only lasted a few months, from March through September of 1862, because of its treasonous views, i.e., its support for the Southern cause. This friend of Lane's was none other than Joaquin Miller. Now again, this is speculation, but I think Lane must have told Miller about the Idaho story, and Miller, being a connoisseur and prolific practitioner in the art of lying your ass off, took it and ran with it. Just my opinion, of course, but it makes sense. And after George Willing died in 1874, may he rest in peace, and a new territory had been organized and actually given the name Idaho, Miller had the story all to himself, and so began to spread it with gusto. Miller's version of the story is that he had been riding with a friend named Colonel Craig toward the Idaho goldfields in 1860, when he heard a Native American traveling with them exclaim, "Idaho," or in some tellings, "Idaho," as the sun rose over the mountains, appearing like a gem of the mountains. Miller's story has been thoroughly debunked, however, because gold wasn't discovered in that region, specifically on Orofino Creek near what is now Pierce, Idaho, until October of 1860, at least 6 months after the debates about the name happened in Congress. But the fact that he was promoting this story and that it was finding its way into newspapers was what prompted William O. Stoddard to write a short column for the New York Daily Tribune in 1875. Stoddard's letter is the only real link we have between George Willing and the name Idaho. And while the story itself is mostly fanciful, it does appear to contain a kernel of truth about where the name came from. That is, that someone invented it, and George Willing convinced Congress to use it. So Stoddard's letter goes, in part, like this.
My eccentric friend, the late Dr. George M. Willing, was the first delegate to Congress from the young mining community. At the time when the subject of the organization of the new territory was under debate, he was, as a matter of course, on the floor of the House of Representatives. Various names had been proposed without any seeming to approach agreement, and the doctor, whose familiarity with Indian dialects was pretty well known, was appealed to by some of his legislative friends for a suggestion. One of them said something round and smooth with the right sort of meaning to it. Now it happened that the little daughter of one of these gentlemen was on the floor that morning with her father, and the doctor, who was fond of children, had just been calling her to him with, "Idaho, come and see me." Nothing could be better, and the veteran explorer promptly responded with the name Idaho. But what does it mean? "Gem of the mountains," replied the quick-witted doctor, with a glance at the fresh face beside him, and the interpretation, like the name, has stuck to this day.
Now, this story is obviously largely bunk. Willing was not the delegate to Congress, may never have stepped foot on the floor of Congress, and the name Idaho was proposed in committee, not on the House floor. The story about the little girl is almost certainly untrue, but it's not clear if the story was made up by Willing or by Stoddard himself. While Stoddard had, in fact, worked in the White House as a correspondence secretary, his two senior colleagues in that position held him largely in contempt, calling him worthless and asinine. But he was very good friends with and handled most of the correspondence duties for Mary Todd Lincoln, and for that his two detractors were quite grateful. Still, Stoddard was known as a practical joker and a self-promoter. In later years, he would claim to have been the first newspaper editor to endorse Lincoln for president and to have drafted the first copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's possible that Stoddard himself embellished the Willing story, but again, we will probably never know. I think it's telling that in response to Joaquin Miller's fanciful story about naming Idaho, that Stoddard came to his late friend's defense by writing this letter in the first place. And while the story is mostly untrue, I believe the fact that he wrote it at all gives it at least some credibility. Part 4. Conclusion. So as you can see, I'm kind of partial to the George Willing story. And I know I've jumped around in time a bit, so I'm going to wrap up by laying out chronologically what I think happened. 1859, George M. Doc Willing goes to the Pikes Peak mines. He gets caught stuffing ballot boxes in the election of B.D. Williams as delegate to Congress. 1860, he still manages to accompany Williams to Washington, D.C., where he helps convince Congress to use the name Idaho for the new territory. He also tells a few choice friends that the word is made up. 1861, the night before the final vote creating the territory, the fraud is discovered. The next day, the name is changed to Colorado. 1862, Senator Joseph Lane helps his friend Joaquin Miller set up a South-supporting newspaper during the Civil War, and probably tells Miller the story about the word Idaho. 1863, Idaho becomes a new Western territory, and Joaquin Miller begins to tell his own, easily falsifiable, tale about the word Idaho. 1874, George Willing, involved in a famous fraudulent land scheme, dies of suspicious circumstances in Prescott, Arizona. 1875, Joaquin Miller now has the story to himself, and begins telling his own version to editors who publish it in a few newspapers. In December, William O. Stoddard writes his letter to the New York Daily Tribune linking George Willing to the name Idaho. Again, much of this is speculation on my part, but it makes sense to me, and I hereby give you permission to make up your own story, because Lord knows everyone else does.